And so on July 4th of this year, I happened to be on Twitter that morning having coffee, having some breakfast, and I saw this tweet that I thought was really funny, but apparently an awful lot of other people did not think that it was funny. It was a tweet from Chris Rock, and because he is a stand-up comedian, of course, it was rather humorous, and I thought it was perfect for the day, right? What Chris Rock said on July 4th was this. He said, "Happy White People's Independence Day." And he went on, which I thought, I mean, he could have stopped right there, and that would have been really funny. But he went on, and he said, "The slaves weren't free, but I'm sure they enjoyed the fireworks," which is also pretty funny. Now, all Chris Rock was saying, really, in that 140-character burst of energy, right, was we don't all see history the same way, right? And we don't see it the same way because we haven't lived it the same way. We haven't experienced the country the same way. It's really the same thing that Frederick Douglass said well over 150 years ago in his speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," in which he made basically the same argument that Chris Rock was making. Granted, Frederick Douglass made it in a little bit prettier and more prose-worthy way rather than a 140-character tweet, you know. Speeches were a bit more eloquent, I suppose, 150 years ago than what we do today online. But the message was basically the same. The message was, you have your historical memory, and by God, I have my historical memory, and they aren't the same. Now, one would think that these very simple words from Chris Rock wouldn't really be that controversial, because after all, what he was saying was true. July 4th simply didn't mean the same to black folk. It certainly didn't mean the same to indigenous native North American peoples as it meant to white folks. And to be honest, it didn't mean the same to white women that it meant to white men. And it didn't mean the same to poor folks without land that it meant to rich folks with lots of land. I mean, obviously, there are many different ways of remembering that era. But apparently, there were a lot of folks who received Chris Rock's Twitter feed who weren't at all happy about what Chris Rock said. And one individual in particular really summed up for me the all too common and very disturbing way in which certain members of the white American community respond to any discussion about racism at all, right? Any discussion of racism past or present, this is how too many white folks respond. It was an individual from South Carolina who fashions himself to be some type of conservative blogger online, but actually he makes his money in his day job as a divorce attorney. So, you know, I suppose one has to do what one has to do, even as one defends family values from those of us who ostensibly would destroy them. But in any event, this blogger, who I'll call Jeff because that's his name, Jeff Schreiber, actually, is his name. Jeff was very upset at Chris Rock, and so he tweeted back. Now, first lesson, and if you don't learn anything else today, this would probably be the thing to learn. You should never get in a Twitter war with a stand-up comedian. Because it is not going to go well for you. And it did not go well for Jeff. So Jeff responds, and he, you know how you do on Twitter, you have the hashtag and whatever you want to say that you're hoping people will then follow throughout the day. So his hashtag was, and I'm going to clean it up and make it a G-rated version of what Jeff said. His version was quite a bit more R-rated, but what he said was hashtag go F yourself, which I'm assuming is language he learned in divorce court among some of his clients who probably speak that way to one another in the midst of their divorce. So Jeff says, go F yourself, and then he goes on to say, slavery existed for 2,000 years before America. We ended it in 100 years, and now we have a black president. Right? So there, basically, is what Jeff was saying to Chris Rock, replying to a historically accurate statement made by Chris Rock with a totally irrelevant rebuttal that has nothing to do with anything, but is the way that oftentimes white folks respond to any discussion about racism. Essentially, think about what Jeff said. Let's break it down into three parts. The first thing he says is the old "they did it too" defense, right? Well, yes, we enslaved other human beings, but you know, other countries also did that, and they did it for 2,000 years, so really, you can't blame us. Now, let's think about this defense for a minute. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I remember trying to use this defense with my mother. On one particular occasion when I had managed, with the help of a friend, to break a window in a neighboring apartment playing baseball. And I remember going to my mother after I was in pretty big trouble for breaking this window and saying something to the effect of, well, you know, it wasn't just me playing baseball. Billy was also throwing the ball, so it's also his fault. Now, as I remember, and you may or may not have had a similar experience, my mother looked at me and said something about Billy and a bridge, and whether, if young William were to throw himself from that bridge, whether I would, in the manner of a damn fool, follow him. Which is to say, she wasn't very impressed by the fact that someone else had been in on the breaking of the window, just like I don't think we ought to be impressed by the fact that throughout human history, people have injured other people, and therefore we need not deal with the injury that we have helped to perpetrate or from which we have in some way as a nation benefited. But that was his first line of defense. We don't need to talk about that because they did it too. The second aspect of his tweet is that we ended slavery in 100 years, which always leads me to ask when others use the word we to describe something, just who is the we that you're talking about? Because the truth is, those who were the conservative activists of the slavery era certainly were not in on that work. Right? They were not the ones who were the abolitionists or the emancipationists. Yes, the Republican Party of those days was the abolitionist party. They were the party more given to emancipation, but conservatives of their day, which is what Jeff is today, right, were the ones trying to conserve, preserve the traditional institution of enslavement. And so Jeff can say all he wishes that we ended slavery, but now some people ended it and a lot of other people just sat around and defended it. And I feel confident that if Jeff had been alive 150 years ago, where he would have sat in that particular conflict. The third thing he says, and this is the funniest of all, he says, now we have a black president. Okay, I am very confident that Jeff had no part in making that happen. I mean, I read his blog. I know that he had nothing to do with that, but he'll take credit for it if it will get him out of a conversation about the historical crime of enslavement. We now have a black president. Yes, the same black president whose election, not once but twice, has now apparently provoked an outpouring of racist hostility, whether it is in the form of racist emails or racist signs at rallies that have been seen both here in Washington and around the country over the last 4 years, or the racist protests that erupted just last week at the University of Mississippi and also at Hampton-Sydney, or the racist tweets and claims that it would be a good thing were the president to be assassinated that we've seen going around the internet. We have 30 states, you may or may not have seen this, but 30 states now where individuals in the last week have petitioned the United States government for the right to secede from the Union because Barack Obama was reelected. I mean, this is taking sore losing to an entirely new level beyond anything that I have ever witnessed before. Because this man who you didn't support wins re-election, you wish to secede from the Union? If black folks threatened to secede from the Union every time an election had not gone their way, they would have left a long damn time ago. But apparently folks like Mr. Jeff in South Carolina and others believe that this new multicultural, multiracial, very different America from the one that they grew up in and prefer is somehow a dangerous destruction of all that we hold dear in our American tradition. Well, some of those traditions are dear, and some of those traditions are worth preserving. But an awful lot of them, like the 200-plus year period of enslavement that emancipation brought to an end, was certainly not among those traditions that were worth preserving. And so we come together today to talk about that, not because we wish to stay in the past, right? Peoples of color, as much as anyone, more than anyone, do not wish to stay in the past. But those who have been the targets of oppression in history understand, perhaps far better than the rest of us, that history is mightily important, is critical for us to remember, so that we do not, in fact, repeat the mistakes of that history. And of course, let us be honest, just because this nation has made progress, and just because this nation has elected now not once but twice a black man as president of the United States, does not tell us anything in and of itself about the larger issues of institutional racial inequality. How do we know that? Well, I could spend literally a semester of academic life demonstrating it to you with data and facts and figures and statistics. It wouldn't be very hard to prove, and I'm sure you have professors here who talk about those things and demonstrate those things every day in class. But beyond that, we don't even have to look at the data to know that. All we have to do is think of an analogy that would help prove the point. And so, for instance, this idea that the election of a man of color somehow signifies the death of racism as a force in America doesn't make any more sense than it would make to say that the election of a woman, Benazir Bhutto, in Pakistan, she was elected in 1988 and again in 1991. No one would say that her election meant that sexism had been eradicated in Pakistan, that somehow the mistreatment of women was no longer there just because a woman had been elected. So too, women have been elected as the head of state in Israel and India and Great Britain and the Philippines and several other places, not here yet, right? But if I were to say to the women in this room, if I were to say to my own two daughters who are 11 and 9 years of age, you know, what you really ought to do is pack your bags and move to Pakistan so that you will now have equal opportunity. I'm assuming that every woman in here, and even my 9-year-old daughter who knows nothing about Pakistan, would still say, no, Daddy, no, that's not a good idea at all. Because we understand in those cases that the individual at the top of the political power structure does not necessarily tell us much about the larger structure. So if in this country we have approximately 90 million peoples of color overall, the fact that the most powerful political player in that country is a person of color does not tell you much about the rest of that 90 million, right?
I believe most of us have been told that the American dream is like a ladder. If we just climb hard enough, we'll reach at the top, right? But what if I told you that for 200 years, the American law has been building or has actually built a physical elevator for the white families while removing the rungs out of the ladder for the black families? Often we've heard that America is post-colonial. Why? Because we've had a black president, that is Obama, right? Or simply because we have many black CEOs. But in this video, Timo is going to show us that having a few black faces at the top doesn't really break a system that was built brick by bricks to favor one family, one race, and undermine the other race. This is the Nic Report, and I'm your host, Nick. And today we're going to talk about color blindness and why pretending that you don't see race is actually making the problem worse. Rest of the video, then we're going to come back with a critical analysis to break down how the American government handed wealth to the white families, right, for centuries, and how these affect us today in 2026. Let's dive right into the video.
Because there are approximately 90 million black folks in this country whose names are neither Barack Obama nor Oprah Winfrey, and whose lives do not necessarily mirror the lives of those individuals who have obtained those high positions of authority. So we have to dig deeper if we really want to understand the legacy of the Emancipation Act, and more to the point, the legacy of the enslavement that made it necessary. The reason we talk about this, and not just in a history class, is because the past comes into the present. The past affects the present. Back in 3rd or 4th grade science class, I remember learning about, and you probably did too, this concept of inertia, right? The idea that an object in motion will tend to continue in the same direction, right, in motion until it is stopped by a force of equal or greater power to prevent it from continuing on its way. So if you roll a rock down a hill, it's going to keep going until the hill ends or it runs into a wall or something, right? That's inertia. But inertia is not just a physical property, you see. It's not just a property of the physical universe. Inertia is, in a very real sense, also a property of the political universe. It is a property of the economic universe. So those things which happen in one generation will affect the next generation and the next generation and the next generation until, like that rock, they come up against a force of equal or greater weight to push against it, you see. And although we have had those counterweights at various points in our history, those forces that pushed against that inertia, there is no way that we can look around and actually believe that those counter forces have been adequate to reverse the effects of that history. Let us talk about the two ways in which this legacy continues into the 21st century. First, there is the material inequality, the economic inequalities of the present era, which directly stem from that long legacy of racial oppression, including enslavement, but also segregation and other forms of discrimination. That material inequality begins historically in the era of enslavement, at a time when white folks, and only white folks, were able to first be considered citizens. That was the decision of the United States Congress, the very first law that the Congress passed after the Constitution was ratified. The very first thing that they did before they did anything else was pass a law called the Naturalization Act of 1790. And what the Naturalization Act of 1790 said, among other things, was that all free white persons and only free white persons could be citizens of the United States. In other words, only they were really deserving of the rights and the liberties granted in the Constitution. That was the law of the land. It gave those of us who were white, or our ancestors, preferential treatment. It was a form of affirmative action, if we were using honest language, but we didn't use that honest language a couple hundred years ago, right? Affirmative action is what we think of when we do anything to try to level the playing field. But why wasn't that affirmative action for those who were white, particularly white property-owning men, right? Because it was a form of preference. And white folks, as a result of that preference, were able to accumulate stuff, were able to accumulate land and money, and of course, other human beings in far too many cases, at a time when peoples of color were being routinely blocked from being able to accumulate land and property. And when you're not allowed in the first generation to accumulate property, you can't do what? You can't hand down that property to one's children or grandchildren. And so what becomes a small inequality perhaps in the first generation, by the third or the fourth generation, after that property has cycled down through the generations, now that inequality gets even bigger, right? Because the thing about wealth and property is it tends to accumulate value very quickly, right? Because of interest, right? If you own land or you have money in the bank, interest means that that's going to grow at a much faster rate than just money itself in your pocket, right? So over time, that first, that second, that third American generation was able to give to its children and grandchildren an extreme head start that is still with us today. In fact, today, the typical white family in this country, not the typical rich white family, just the typical right in the middle white family, has about 20 times the net worth of the typical African American family, about 18 times the net worth of the typical Latino family. It is not because we've worked harder, God knows. It is not because we have prayed harder, God certainly knows. And it is not because we as white folks possess some superior investment wisdom about which people of color are lacking. I mean, if you have paid no attention at all to what's happened in the last 5 years on Wall Street, you should at least be able to know this much, that a handful of rich white dudes can lose a hell of a lot of money. And they can do it without any help from black people. They can do it without any help from Latino people, any help from Asian Americans, no Native Americans, just a handful of the richest, smartest, most educated white guys on Wall Street, and they lost approximately $12 trillion of other people's money over the course of about an 18-month period. Think about that. 12 trillion wiped off the books by rich white dudes. If black people stole $12 trillion of other people's money, there would be a congressional investigation. People would be going to jail and prison for long periods of time. That too is the legacy of racism. A differential standard for white folks who break the rules as opposed to people of color who break the rules, you see. That too is part of that legacy. But it wasn't just enslavement that created this inequality. It's also the fact that when the government tried, and it did, for just a brief moment, tried to rectify some of that legacy with the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank, which were two institutions established in the post-slavery period specifically for the purpose of helping those who had been formerly owned as property to get their own land, their own tools, right, and the ability to start their lives over as free people. It was an effort, if you will, at reparations, although not a huge effort, but still an important one. And yet, the Supreme Court of the United States, within just a few years of the time that those institutions were set up, struck them down, got rid of them, ruled that they were not constitutional. And when they did so, in 1883, one of the Supreme Court justices, Joseph Bradley, made the famous comment that the reason we didn't need to help those who had been formerly enslaved was because it was time for them to stop being the special favorites of the law. The special favorites of the law, as if somehow black folks were being specially favored just because they had a Freedmen's Bureau and a Freedmen's Bank, ignoring the fact that it was actually white Americans who had been the special favorites when they were made citizens and nobody else was, for 200 years going back to the colonial period when they and only they could accumulate property. But Joseph Bradley and his colleagues on the court basically say in 1883, so we're talking, 20 years essentially after emancipation, and only about a decade after these institutions were established to help the former slaves, is basically saying, okay, enough of that. Enough of all that help. And he then said, and this is part of his actual statement. It's time for the Negro to become no longer the special favorite of the laws, but to take his place as a mere citizen, right? Now, keeping in mind that black folks hadn't even been able to be citizens at all up until a few years before this. And you can see the irony in the comment, right? But the point is, when the government tried to do something at the time to deal with this legacy, the Supreme Court struck it down. That's why we're still talking about it. Because when some folks wanted to do right by the newly emancipated peoples and wanted to make sure that they had truly equal opportunity or something at least close to it, the highest court said no, that we couldn't do that. And here we are, 150 years after emancipation, never having taken those steps for more than a handful of years, wondering why we're still having to talk about it. Well, that's why we're still having to talk about it. And of course, in 1862, the very same year that the D.C. Emancipation Act was put into effect, that we're here today to remember, that was the same year that this government passed the Homestead Act. And what was the Homestead Act? The Homestead Act was a law that gave out over 250 million acres of basically free land to white folks. People of color were blocked in almost all cases from being able to obtain that land. And of course, that land had been stolen from native peoples. So this was in every sense a redistribution of resources from people of color to white folks. So the Homestead Act is passed, gives out all of this free land that allows white families to accumulate wealth. That too gets passed down. And so today, the estimates are that there are about 50 million white Americans still living on that land that their ancestors received, or not living on it, but they have benefited from it because it has been sold over those years and the money ultimately stayed in the family. So in some way, 50 million white folks have benefited from this huge government program. Now, if people of color had done that, we would call that a handout. We would call that a welfare program. We would blame the recipients for not wanting to work hard enough for their stuff, because that's what folks say today whenever we talk about something like food support, or we talk about income support, paltry little income support, or housing assistance, or God forbid, a health insurance plan that covers pre-existing conditions. When we talk about those minor things, folks say, well, now that's a handout for the lazy. But when you give out 250 million acres of somebody else's land to white folks so they can have farms and ranches and houses and pass that down to their children, we don't call that a handout. We call that nation building, you see. That's the difference, very different form of analysis. And so today we have these massive inequalities. We see that right here in Washington, D.C. You don't have to look elsewhere to see this inequality, right? You are in a town that has among the highest income gaps between white folk and black folk of any city in this country. We know, for instance, when it comes to unemployment and joblessness, that folks west of the Anacostia River have an unemployment rate under 9%. Even that is too high, right? But folks who are east of the Anacostia have an unemployment rate of 35%. So we're talking almost 4 times the rate of unemployment between two communities separated by a river. And as you know, it's not a very wide river, right? And yet it is wide enough to mask these huge disparities in opportunity. There is currently, as I'm sure many of you know, a 73-point gap between white and black 8th grade students in Washington, D.C. on math achievement scores. 73 points in terms of proficiency. That's double the national average, which is already bad enough. I mean, if you have a 36-point gap, that's not acceptable. But in Washington, D.C., it's a 73-point gap, and folks act like there's no way to do anything about that, other than apparently to lower the standards that we expect for folks who are black and folks who are Latino and students who are poor, as if somehow we just don't know how to educate them. But now folks do know how to educate them, because even under segregation, even at a time when black folks were limited to severely underfunded schools only in their own neighborhoods under Jim Crow segregation, those black educators reached those children. You know, the difference was that those children under segregation knew that those teachers loved them. And those children under segregation knew that those teachers not only loved them, but knew them because they lived in the neighborhood. And they had an interest in seeing to it that all children could learn. Now, that's not to romanticize segregation. It is not to say that those were the good old days, because they were not. But we could learn something from the intentionality of the educators under segregation. Because there's no way that under segregation, those teachers and those principals and those administrators and those school board folks would have allowed a program to come into place that says we're not going to expect the same out of these children as these children. That wouldn't have been allowed under segregation. That would not have been allowed. And yet here we are, not only in Washington, but in other places around the country, saying we're going to hold white folks to this standard and we're going to hold black folks to this standard down here. And the rationale that they give is, well, you know, folks are starting out farther behind, so even if we lower the standard, they still have to make progress faster. And that's true. But ultimately, the message that gets sent when you say to some students, we don't expect you to attain this, we only expect you to attain this, is a presumption of their inferiority. It is a presumption that they just can't cut it, and no matter what we do, they'll never be able to cut it. What kind of message do we want to send to young people, right? Young people who come from communities that have survived enslavement, that have survived segregation, that have survived lynching, that have survived the worst that the world has to offer them. And now we're saying that despite all of that strength that those communities obviously possess, or else they wouldn't have survived those things, despite that, we're just going to throw in the towel. And we're going to say that we can't really expect much more out of these folks. The problem in our schools is not those children. The problem are the tools that we're using to evaluate those children. Giving students all across this country standardized tests, even though they are totally unstandardized schools, unstandardized resources, unstandardized textbooks, unstandardized teacher training. You can't take kids who have been given totally different types of education and then give them one test and call that fair. If you want to give folks a standardized test and then evaluate them on it, you have a moral obligation to standardize the money in those schools and to standardize the training of the teachers in those schools, but we don't do that. We believe in standardizing the punishment. We believe in standardizing the evaluation tools, but we don't believe in standardizing the power and the equality. And that, too, is a legacy of enslavement. Because, see, what the history of enslavement and racism did.
So welcome back, guys, and I hope you found that video to be insightful. Actually, TeamWise has a way of using anecdotes to illustrate and demonstrate and isn't the way we understand his speech, because, man, this guy is far beyond, his era. So don't forget to share and subscribe so that we may reach a wider audience, because this is the message that the world has to hear. This is the message that America has to hear, because TeamWise has mentioned many important things that we need to discuss. One of the most important things TeamWise has mentioned was the myth of progress, where we see a black president, that is President Obama, or a black billionaire, and we think, see, anyone can make it. But why is TeamWise uses a brilliant comparison? Just because the country has a woman leader doesn't mean sexism is gone. That is right. For white Americans, seeing a black man in power felt like mission complete, mission accomplished, right? It felt like Now, racism has come to an end or is coming to an end. But for black Americans, one man in the White House didn't fix the fact that black home applicants are still denied loans at twice the rate of white applicants. Because when we focus on the exemption, right, the few who made it, we give the system an excuse to keep failing the many. We have to stop using black success stories to ignore the reality of black struggles. So let's talk about the wealth secret that happened between 1790 and 1862. This is the part that usually isn't in the history books. Tim Wise talks about the Naturalization Act of 1790 and the Homestead Act of 1862. These aren't just old dates; they are the reason the wealth gap we see today. They're the reason the wealth gap exists today. So in 1790, the government explicitly said only free white persons could become citizens. That gave white immigrants a 200-year head start on voting, owning property, and building a future. The Homestead Act gave millions of acres of free land, right? And almost all of it went to the white settlers. So today, nearly 50 million white adults are living off the inheritance and the head start of that free land that was provided that year. So what's the reality check here? When white families were given free land and protection by the government, black families were treated as property, right? Then later they were treated as sharecroppers. Then they were shut out of the suburbs, right? So you can't have a fair race when one side got a 200-year head start and a free gear. Weiss explains that you don't need a bad guy in a hood for a system to be racist. How? So think about banking. If a bank uses credit history to give loans, but black families were historically denied the chance to build that credit, the bank is being racist, even if the banker is a nice guy, right? So we fund schools based on how much the houses in the area are worth. Because white houses were subsidized by the government for decades and black houses were redlined and devalued, the system automatically gives white kids better schools. It's an automated machine that produces unequal results every single time. For many years, we've been told that not seeing race, that being colorblind is actually the goal. But Tim Wise says that that is a very naked lie. So if a white person says, I don't see color, they're choosing not to see the advantages they have. It's like a person with a full plate of food saying they don't see hunger to someone who hasn't eaten for nearly 3 days. We have to see race to see the damage. We have to see that black lives are being treated differently by the American law, by the banks, and by the police. If you don't see it, you can't fix it, right? So Tim Wise ends with a challenge that hits at home. He tells the white Americans to stop talking about their good intentions. Why? Because it doesn't really matter that you have a good heart, right? If you still benefit uh, from the system that keeps hurting the black community and the brown communities, right? And here we come to the end of our discussion today. Real justice is going to be uncomfortable, especially to the white Americans that have decided to see the truth. So, are you going to be on the part of those white Americans that are colorblind, the black people and the brown people, or are you going to see the truth? So, share your expression, share your thought in the comments below. And this is the Nic Report. I was your host, and I'm still your host, Nic. If you're new to this channel, consider subscribe, like, and share. Until next time, stay vigilant and don't be colorblind. See the truth.